Welcome to Gemara Markings. Today's Shiur is Yuma Daf Zayin. We begin today's Shiur 10 lines from the bottom of Daf Zayin. Note that we are 10 lines from the bottom of the Daf. You will notice a Roman numeral to the immediate left-hand side of the Gemara text, a number 3. We're in the middle of a general search for sources that the Chamisha Inuyim, the 5 practices of abstention that characterize the observance of Yom Kippur, what are the sources that they are referred to as Inui? We call the Chamisha Inuyim. So up till now, we've dealt with Achila Shtia, which is considered one, and we've dealt with Sicha, which is a second Inui, and now we deal with the third, and that's Ne'ilas Sandal, the abstention from wearing shoes. On the side of the Gemara, you'll notice we have a mivneh. It's a structural note where we try to describe the different markings as they come along. So you'll notice a double underline is used, and this is on the side explained as nisyonos attempts l'mso mokor l'ne'ilas hasandal tenikra inui, that the issue of shoe wearing comes under the category of inui. So we turn to the Gemara. Une'ilas hasandal minalon. From where do we know that the abstention of wearing shoes is categorized as inui? Dichtiv, we have a pasuk, and the context of this pasuk involves David HaMelech running or escaping from his rebellious son Avshalom, who toward the end of David HaMelech's life usurped the monarchy. So it says, V'David oile b'male hazesim oile boiche v'roish loy chofui v'hu hoilech yochef. Describes David as ascending the Mount of Olives. He's crying, and amongst other things, it mentions here that he is hu holech yochef. Yochef mimai. When the term yochef means missing something in a general framework, so what is he missing? What is he lacking? Lav minilas sandal. Is it not that he is lacking shoes? So he's running barefoot, and he is without shoes. Now, it's important to note, and we have to tie this pasuk into that which we saw before. Just a few lines above the line that we opened up today's Shiur, if you're using, of course, our marked Gemaras, you will notice 4 lines before that, there was at the beginning of the line, it says, B'chol asher hisane ovi, and that pasuk we had written between the lines a very important note. That's Brichas David Mipnei Avshalom Mikra Inui. That when we see psukim concerning David HaMelech's escape from Avshalom, it is characterized as Hisane Ovi Inui. So psukim that are in this context of his running from Avshalom are categorized as Inui. So if we can establish that he's Holech Yochef in his escape from Avshalom, so then and explain that Yochef means Milas Hasando, lacking shoes, then here we would have a source that lacking of shoes is considered Inui. As we continue, you can see we have a volcano shape, a trapezoid, and on the side of our Gemara we describe this as Dchios. These are attempts of the Gemara to reject that which had just been said as a source that Nilas Hasandal is called Inui. So here the Gemara says, V'dilma misusya u mitarka. Maybe what Yochef refers to in the pasuk, and we said Yochef means in a general term, as a general term it means lacking. So maybe it means he's lacking a horse, and a matarka is a rod or a staff that's used for hitting the horse to make it go faster. So Yochef, as far as this Gemara is concerned at this point that he was holech yochef, he was without horse and rod. Elo Omar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchok Mehacha. And again, the double underline introducing another source. Lech upasachta osak me'al mosnecha v'nacha tachlois me'al raglecha. Uksiv vayas kein haloich oroim v'yochef. So here we have a pasuk that it describes his removal of shoe. The Novi Yeshaya was told to remove his shoe, and it describes him as walking, Aroim v'yochef. Yochef mimai. What does yochef mean? Lav mineilas hasadol. So here we would be going back and insisting that yochef does mean lacking of shoes. And not like we suggested, it means he was lacking, in the case of David it was lacking a horse. We're trying to define yochef. So yochef might in fact mean lacking of shoes. And that's what it seems to be in this pasuk, because just the line before, the Almighty said, remove the shoes from your feet, and he is now walking yochef. So without shoes on feet, one is called yochef. That would then explain by David HaMelech he was yochef, and that was while he was running from Avshalom. And we said that when he was running from Avshalom, he was considered in inui. The Gemara rejects this. V'ema b'min olim hamatulayim. Maybe the pasuk by Yeshaya, the prophet Yeshaya, where he was instructed to walk aroim v'yochef, means he was walking with patched shoes. Metuloim is shoes that have tuloim on them, patched shoes. If you don't accept this pshat, but stick to the literal, total lacking of shoes, Oroim mamish, the pasuk said orom. And now orom mamish means naked, literally naked. Can you imagine that the Almighty told Yeshaya to walk naked? Ella, what orom meant was bivgodim bluyim, worn out clothing. Hachanami b'minolim hamatulam. So too, he was instructing the prophet to walk with worn out, patched shoes. So far, we don't have evidence that yochef means without shoes. Ela Omar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchok Mehacha, from the following pasuk. The pasuk says, Min'i raglech miyochef ugronech mitzim'ah. And now we explain. Min'i atzmech min hachet kidei shelo yovo raglech lidei yochuf. Abstain from sin so that your feet don't come to be yochuf, barefoot in your escape, in your exile to the diaspora. Min'i l'shonech midvar b'telim kidei shelo yovo gronech lidei tzim'ah. And likewise, abstain from evil speech or from empty speech, so that you don't come to thirst. So in this pasuk, the Gemara feels that min'i raglech mi yochef is prevent a situation from becoming barefoot. So that yochef in this pasuk clearly refers to a state of barefoot, and as we said before, you would then take this information, plug it back into the opening pasuk that David was holech yochef in his escape from Avshalom, and we said before that in the escape from Avshalom, that is categorized as hisaneh or inui, hence we have the source that Nilas Sandal is categorized as inui. In other words, the abstention from wearing shoes is a form of inui. We continue. Tashmish hamito dikri inui minolam. From where do we know that abstaining from intimacy with one's wife, that is considered inui? Dichtiv. The pasuk says, and here the context of the pasuk is Lavan and Yankov Avinu. Lavan was the father of the Imohis, Rachel and Leah, and it should be noted that when Lavan gave his daughters over to Yankov, in addition to Rachel and Leah, he also gave two more women, Bilhah and Zilpah, they commonly referred to as their bondmaids. There's midrashic literature on the identity of Bilhah and Zilpah, more extensive information, but for our purposes, we'll just make reference to their having been given over at the same time as Leah and Rachel were given to Yaakov. So the pasuk says, "Im tane es benoisai v'im tikach noshim." We continue at the top of Amid Beis. The Gemara breaks down the pasuk. Im tane. This is Lavan warning Yaakov to be good to his daughters, to be good to Lavan's daughters, namely Yaakov Avinu's wives. And he says, "Im tane mitashmish." Don't cause them pain through withholding intimacy from them. If my daughters, your wives, desire intimacy, so provide that for them. So that you see here that inui is associated with tashmish. The im tikach, and that pasuk also said the im tikach. Lavan was warning Yaakov meet sorrows, meaning don't take additional wives. Soros are co-wives. Don't take additional co-wives. In other words, I'm giving you these women, my daughters, that is it. V'ema idi v'idi mitzoros. Why not say that the pasuk im tane that he's im tane es b'nosai v'im tikach noshim? The entire pasuk is don't afflict my daughters by taking additional wives. So that there's no reference here to intimacy. It's just one warning, don't take additional wives. So the Gemara answers that's not the pshat. We should have pointed out, by the way, that this double underline marking that you see is explained on the side. The emo word is highlighted. These are nisyonis lidchei samoker litashmish dahavin inui. These are attempts to dispel the pasuk that we cited as the source. So the Gemara suggested maybe the whole pasuk is a warning not to take co-wives, and that's what ta'aneh is referring to. No reference to intimacy. So the Gemara responds, miksiv im tikach. Does it say is that the word that appears im tikach? Ve'im tikach. See, there's a vav associated with the word ve'im. Had the pasuk been without the vav in front of the word ve'im, it would have read im tane es benosai. Do not afflict my daughters. How? Im tikach noshim, by taking additional wives. But it doesn't say that. It says im tanes benoisai v'im. V'im indicates that the v'im tikach is a separate point. So that would reinstate our source. Im tane, meaning don't withhold tashmish from them. V'ema idi v'idi mitzoros. Here we go back to say no. Maybe im tane and v'im and ve'im tikach are both referring to co-wives, and there are two types of co-wives or issues of co-wife involved here. And what are the two issues? Chad litzoros didei, v'chad litzoros the asyon le me'almo, dunya the im tikach. First of all, let's make it clear that im tikach noshim would imply, according to this, taking wives from outside. As we said before, Lavan presented to Yaakov 4 women: Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. The main wives would be Rachel and Leah. The bondmaids, also in the picture, but not as real full-fledged wives. What is the possibility? What is the Amos suggesting? That Lavan is saying as follows: Im tanes benosai, do not afflict my daughters, Rachel and Leah, by equalizing Bilhah and Zilpah, the bondmaids, to grant them equal status to Rachel and Leah. True, I'm giving you Bilhah and Zilpah along with Rachel and Leah, but they are to be maintained as second stringers, so second level relationship with them, not a primary level relationship as you will have with Rachel and Leah. So that's one thing, but it's within the realm of soros, of co-wives. And the second thing he was saying is, im tikach means don't take outside women whatsoever. So according to this Amor rejection, there is no reference in the pasuk to ta'aneh as being associated with intimacy. The Gemara answers that what we just presented wouldn't follow a logical thought pattern. And why is that? According to our suggestion, the first thing that Lavan was mentioning was don't equalize Bilhah and Zilpah to Rachel and Leah. As far as seriousness is concerned, if you have a father trying to protect his daughters, the more serious effort or issue would be taking additional outside wives into this family unit. Being that would be a more serious, let's say, offense to the existing wives, you would mention that first. Don't do this more serious thing, and don't even do this lesser thing, namely of equalizing Bilhah Zilpah to Rachel and Leah. That's what logic would have said. And again, the basis or the assumption that's made here, and we are going to stick with that, is that the term im tikach noshim is a reference to taking women from outside, bringing them into the family as new wives. But that's not the first thing that was mentioned. The first thing was im ta'aneh. So the Gemara explains, now we can read this in the text. Miksiv im tikach v'im ta'aneh. Does it say, did Lavan say it in that order? First saying, don't take women from the outside, and then don't equalize Bilhah and Zilpah to Rachel and Leah. That's not what he said. He said, im ta'aneh v'im tikach siv. So that the order dictates that the im ta'aneh has nothing to do with the realm of co-wife. That, in fact, has to do with tashmish, as we said at the outset. So we see from here that withholding the abstention from intimacy is categorized as inui. Omale Rav Papa L'Abaye Ha tashmish gufa ikri inui. Rav Papa seems to be saying to Abaye that how can you say that the abstention from tashmish is called inui when the act itself is referred to as inui dechtiv? The pasuk says regarding Shechem and Dinah, the daughter of Yaakov. It says in that context, Vayishkav oisa vaya'aneha. Vayishkav has to do with sleeping together, it's intimacy with her, vaya'aneha. So that Tashmish, he was with her in intimacy. And that intimacy itself is called inui. So the Gemara answers no. What was described here is Omale. Abaye answers Hasam Sha'ina Mebi'ois Achirois. That means, yes, he did sleep with her, he did experience intimacy, however, he withheld from her additional acts of intimacy. It was, even if he saw later that she was desirous, he prevented her from that experience. The Rashi says, when he would later see her desirous of him, and he didn't have relations with her at the time. The Gemara continues, and we have a topic heading on the side that we're going to deal with Rechitza b'Yom Kippur, bathing on Yom Kippur. Tonu Rabbanan, also lirchotz miktsas gufo kechol gufo. It's forbidden to bathe even part of your body, just as an entire bath is prohibited. If a person was soiled, was dirtied with clay or with feces or dung, rochetz kedarkoi v'eino choshesh. removal of dirt through washing is allowed. One can can wash in the normal fashion, doesn't have to worry, because his purpose in washing is to remove the dirt and not just to achieve a good feeling of having washed. Asur losuch mixas gufo kechol gufo. It is forbidden to smear an ointment or oils, sicha, smearings of lotions are forbidden on Yom Kippur, even if it's on part of one's body, just as it's forbidden on the entire body. If a person was ill, or he has scabs in his head, and in order to solve the problem of sores in his head, he needs to smear on an ointment or lotion. Soch kedarkoi veino choshish. She can smear on in a regular way and does not have to be concerned. Tana debe Menashe. In the yeshiva of Menashe, we have the following source taught. Rav Shiur Lil Omer, Madicha Isha Yoda Achas B'Mayim V'Nesenes Pas Latinoik V'Eino Chosheshes. Madicha has to do with washing. A woman who needs to feed her child, she can wash one hand. She's going to feed the child by giving bread. Here it says Nosenes Pas, giving her bread, giving the child bread. And this washing is explained to remove what's known as the ruach ra of the morning. There's after a person sleeps, he gets up in the morning, there is said to be a ruach ra, loosely translated, an evil spirit that rests upon one's hands, the hands of someone who had been sleeping, gets up in the morning. He needs to remove that. The removal of that ruach ra is done through a hand washing. So water is poured over the hand, and it's Yom Kippur. So in order to enable the woman to feed the child without having to contend with this ruach ra, so we allow her to wash one hand, and that's not a problem of rechitza. Let us read Rashi. Madicha es yada lefi shuach ra shel alechem hanilkach biyodayim sheloi not lon shachris. There is an evil spirit that dwells on the bread that is taken by hands that weren't washed in the morning. The shem hashed shivsa. The name of the demon is shivsa. According to Rashi, by careful reading of Rashi, it appears that the evil spirit is not on the hands. The evil spirit is on the bread, and it's on the bread that's taken by hands that were not washed. Let's continue in the Gemara. Amru alav al Shammai hazaken shelo rotze lahachil biyodei achas. It was said about Shammai the elder, the famous Shammai who was the colleague of Hillel Hazaken. Shammai was a person who, in many aspects of halacha, he exercised restraint, restriction, stringency. So it says about him, he didn't want to feed with one hand. The Gazru olav lahachil b'shtei yadayim, and they ruled his stringency kind of backfired in his face, in the sense that they then imposed upon him an obligation to wash both hands. My taima, what is the reason? The Gemara here is asking, even though we read Rashi already, the Gemara is asking, what is the reason for this hand washing? Amar Abaye mishum shivsa, because of that demon that we saw Rashi describe as his name being Shivsa. Let's take a look at the Rashi, at the Tosfos at the top. There's only one Tosfos on this page, but let's look at it together. Mishum Shivsa, Pirush Rashi, Ruach Ra Nashura al Hayodayim, Shalonot Lon Shachris. Now, we read the Rashi together, and that exact language is not in our version of Rashi. So, in other words, when we explained the Gemara before reading the Rashi, we explained the Gemara based on the presentation that Tosfos makes of Rashi, that the Ruach Ra is on the hands that were not washed. Careful reading of our text of Rashi, though, seems to indicate that the Ruach Ra is on the bread that is taken by hands that were not washed. Whatever the case is, let's continue in the Tosfos. Rabbeinu Tam Meforish, de below Nesinas Pas Latinok, Muter Litol Yodov Shachris B'Yom Kippurim. Rabbeinu Tam says that without the issue of feeding a child bread, it is muter for one to wash his hands on Yom Kippur in the morning. The hand washing of the morning is no less of a concern than one who washes to remove dirt. We said in the Gemara that if the washing is to remove dirt, it's totally allowed. Rabbeinu Tam is saying that the morning hand washing to remove the Ruach Ra is totally allowed. Again, we're repeating ourselves, even without an issue of feeding a child. Regarding Tit Ubitzoa, we said that one is allowed to wash in a normal way to remove dirt, and likewise to remove the evil spirit. There is no greater example of filth than one whose hands are not washed in the morning. What do you mean? You look at his hands, they don't seem to have any dirt on it. However, hands that are not washed in the morning, a person who has unwashed hands is not allowed to touch any of his orifices. He can't touch his mouth, his nostrils, his ears, his eyes. Any body openings are forbidden to be touched by unwashed hands, unwashed morning hands. As it says in Maseches Shabbos, Yad Lepet Tiktzatz, and the Gemara says Mishum Bas Melech. Bas Melech is the name of the demon that afflicts afflicts a person who didn't wash his hands and touches these openings. V'shivsa dehacha inyan acher havoid, and the Gemara mentions shivsa. So Rabbeinu Tam is explaining that shivsa mentioned in the Gemara is a different issue. Notice sheshira al ha'oichel kishebo litain pas latinok ben daled v'hei shonim v'choin kotzim lo nato yodav v'yisisha. It's very interesting to note that the explanation that Tosfos is giving for shivsa is exactly, or it's awfully close to that which Rashi, according to our version of the Rashi text, is concerned. Again, the Tosfos is saying that the shivsa is something that dwells upon the oichel, and we saw that in Rashi. It's a ruach ra that is on the bread that is contacted by the unwashed hands. So there doesn't seem to be if you accept this explanation of shivsa, it actually is in line with what Rashi seemed to say. So the Bach points out that there's a Rashi in Tainus which seems to be like what Tosfos is saying over here, and we're saying even further that Rashi here seems to be along those lines. Or let's say more accurately, as far as the Bach is concerned, there is a comment made in Maseches Tainus on this topic. One can look that up, which is beyond the purview of our Shiur today. But we continue here that Tosfos describes the shivsa as an entity that can cause strangulation of the child if he eats from food that's given to him by someone who did not wash their hands. And here you see something very interesting, even though the person washed their hands already in the morning. So that the hand washing in the morning solves the person's contact with his own body. But when he comes to give food to a child in the morning, he would need to wash his hands again. Tosfos now makes a comment that has a more of a, let's say, a ramification to that which is of a more, say, common or contemporary nature. Tosfos writing his commentary hundreds and hundreds of years after the Gemara, so Tosfos is commenting on the fact that the public doesn't seem to be so diligent in these hand washings. He says, Tosfos maintains that evil spirit is not present in these areas, in these kingdoms. Just like we, Tosfos says, we are not that diligent with avoiding leaving water exposed, or zugos is something that is described in Maseches Psachim in the 10th parak as being careful not to eat things in pairs, in even numbers of two or four. One shouldn't eat 2 apples or 4 pears, etc. We aren't careful about these things, and that's because whatever evil spirits that have to do with those practices aren't present in our areas. Again, this is our reading of Tosfos. We've said many, many times with regard to our recorded Gemara marking Shiur, we have no intention of conveying what actual halacha lemaisa practice is, actual legal practice is concerned. For that, one has to consult a proper rabbinic authority and study the sforim that deal with halacha lemaisa, because as far as these topics are concerned, there is much more on the issue regarding the hand washings, regarding gilui and zugos, etc. Let's turn back to the Gemara. We're picking up the Gemara on the 4th wide line. Tanu Rabbanan, Haholech lahakbil pnei oviv. Actually, before we learn the Gemara itself, we should take advantage of our topic heading on the side, where we've written we're going to deal with halicha b'soich mayim b'yom kippur, walking through water on Yom Kippur kedei lahakbil pnei mi shegadol mimenu, because he's on his way to greet someone who is of a higher status than himself. And we'll see examples: one's teacher, one's parent, or another person who is greater. O kedei lagil l'drasha, or walking through water because he needs to get to a Torah lecture. Another issue that will be dealt with is ma hadin lachzor habayisa me'adrasha. What about coming back from a lecture? Can he walk back and walk through water in order to get back home? Regarding that point, we're going to see 2 Lashonos in the Gemara, and under our Mivneh heading, we can tell you ahead of time. You see Roman numerals 1 and 2 in the Gemara text on the right-hand side of the Gemara text. They represent Shnei Lashonos B'inyan Chazora Me'adrasha, 2 versions of the Gemara regarding that topic of going through water upon one's return from the drasha. And of course, we're talking about Yom Kippur. Later on the Amid, the Gemara will address the issue of what about going through water on Shabbos. But as we said, that will be something dealt with later in the Gemara. The text in the Gemara, we said we're picking up the 4th wide line, Tanu Rabbanan, Haholech lahakbil pnei oviv o pnei rabbi o pnei misha godol mimenu, person who is on his way to greet his father, his teacher, Torah teacher, or someone who is greater than himself. Over at savoro b'mayim ve'eno choshish. One can pass through water even neck deep. That's quite a deep pool of water, and he doesn't have to worry about being in violation of bathing on Yom Kippur. Of course, we're talking about a situation where that's his only way to get there. If he could easily walk around it, so we're not giving you, the Gemara is not giving you license to go specifically through the water. Ibayalaho, Harav Eitzel Talmid Mai. What about a Rav who wants to visit his student? Can he go through the water? Toshma, so we answer this. The Omer of Yitzchak Bar Chano, Ano Chazise L'Zeiri, the Ozal Legabi Rav Chia Bar Ashi Talmidei. So Rav Yitzchok tells us that I saw Ziri going through water on Yom Kippur to greet his student Rav Chia bar Ashi. Rav Ashi disagrees. He says, Rav Ashi Omar, that's no proof, because in fact the opposite happened. That story was Rav Chia bar Ashi, who the Azal Gabe, the Zeiri Rabbe. The one who was walking was the student going through water to greet his teacher, Zeiri. Rava Shara Livnei Aver Yamina. Rava allowed the people of that community, Aver Yamina, Lemeva B'maya, to go through water, Linturi Piri, to watch fruits. And of course, this is all on Yom Kippur, and they had people in that community were watchmen of fruit storage. So they were allowed to go through water to watch fruits, to keep them from being stolen. Omar le Abaye l'Rava. Tanya de Messiah loch. Abaye cites a Tanakh source to support Rava's ruling. Shomrei peros oivrin ad savoran b'mayim v'ein choshin. Guards of fruits are entitled to walk through water neck deep and don't have to worry about bathing on Yom Kippur. In other words, don't have to worry about having violated the restriction of bathing on Yom Kippur. Rav Yosef Shora Lehu Livnei Beit Tarbu Lemevar B'Maya Lemesi Lepirka. Rav Yosef allowed the people of Beit Tarbu, the name of a place, to go through water in order to arrive at a Torah drasha, a Torah lecture. Lemezal Lo Shora Lehu. To return home, though, he would not allow them. So that if their only choice was to simply stay put until the end of Yom Kippur, because they had no option of getting home other than through water, they'd just have to stay put where they were. Omar le Abaye. In Cain, Abaye says to Rav Yosef, if you impose this restriction, then ato machshilon la'osid lavo, then you're going to cause them, literally machshilon is to stumble, but it means that you're going to cause them next year not to come to the drasha in the first place. So that as far as Abaye is concerned, the ends justifies the means, and if the means to encourage them to come to the drasha is by enabling them to get home, so allow them to go through the water at the end of the drasha on their return home as well. Ika the Amri, Shora Lahu Lemesi, V'Shora Lahu Lemezal. Now, the dash underlining highlights the difference between the two versions. This is our second version, where Rav Yosef allowed them to come to the drasha, and he allowed them to go back home. Amar le Abaye. Abaye reacts. Bishlomo lemesi l'chai. I understand you're allowing them to come to the drasha. L'chai means that's good, that makes sense. El lemezal my taima, but to go back home, what's the reason? They're not going to hear Torah learning. Answer, so Rav Yosef says, Kedei shalotei machshilin lo lavo, so that it doesn't pose a stumbling to them for next year. It's of utmost importance that people come to the drasha, and if the only way to encourage them to do so is to enable them to go back home, so be it, and therefore I allow them to go back home. It's interesting to note that if you evaluate the maskana of both of these lashonos, in the first lashon Abaye was saying you must let them go back home, and in the second lashon as well, the result is they must be allowed to get back home. Rav Yehuda, Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda havukaimi aguda tenahar pras. You have two individuals, Rav Yehuda and Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda. I would like to make the assumption, in order to make a comment later on, that Rav Yehuda and his son, this is Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda, it could be that Rav Shmuel was simply, his father happened to have the same name as Rav Yehuda here, but it wasn't his son. That is open for debate. But nevertheless, you have these two individuals, Rav Yehuda and Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda, that were standing. Aguda is the bank of a river, and the river was the Pras River. And they were standing. The Pras River was a very large river. Sometimes it's translated as the Euphrates River. if that is the case, so be it. That happens to be a major river today. And they were standing Amavra de Hatzdad, at a particular crossing point. Mavra is a crossing point. Could be there was a bridge there. Other places it's a reference to a ferry, but it's a crossing point, and the crossing point was located at Hatzdad. So they were standing at the banks of the Pras River at this point, Mavra de Hatzdad. The Havukoi Rami Bar Papa Mehakis on the other side. We saw a reference to this in the Mishnah. He put on his golden clothing, and he did. Rami calls out to them, can I cross the river in order to ask of you a question of Torah learning? It's interesting that he was able to call this out to them, but maybe the discussion that he had to be quiet, or it was a long discussion. He couldn't keep shouting that long. Whatever the case is, that's a technical issue. The bottom line is, can I cross the river in order to ask of you a question of Torah learning? Omar Le Rav Yehuda. Now here you'll notice we have an aleph, there's an Iko Diami on the next line, there are two versions. So Omar Le Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda answers, Rav Ushmuel Dami Chervayu, both Rav and Shmuel say, Oiver ubilvad shelo yodoi mitachas chefas chaluko. You're allowed to cross, provided you don't extend your hands from underneath your clothing, the border of your clothing. Now, Rashi explains, mitachas chefas, we're looking at Rashi further down the page, last quarter of the page, mitachas chefas svas chaluko lagbia shule chaluko al zroo, that when crossing the river, we don't want you raising your hands, raising the clothing. In other words, if you can imagine, just for illustration purposes, that you were dressed in a robe, and the robe didn't have, let's say the robe was a type of poncho or a thing that covered your body, and covered your shoulders, your arms, your whole body, without sleeves. Everything was contained. Your arms were contained under the robe. And all of this is to illustrate the Rashi. So do not raise, as you're walking through the water, don't raise your arms, thereby raising the garment, raising it on your arms. Di'eno nira kemalbush. Elo kenoise al ksefo, because then that gives the impression, doesn't look like you're wearing it, it looks like you're carrying it on your shoulders. The one who walks out on Shabbos from a private domain into the street with a garment that's slung around his shoulders, or that's draped around his shoulders, that's not the way you wear a clothing, that's the way you carry it. And that would be prohibited on Shabbos. So Rav Yehuda is answering Rami Bar Papa's question. You want to cross the river, you can do so, but don't raise your garment as we just described in the Rashi. Don't raise it around your shoulders. Ika di Amri, another version of the story is Omar le Rav Shmuel Bar Rav Yehuda Tanina. So in this version, you have the son answering by citing a Tanaic source. He says there's a source that says Oiver ubilvad shelo yotzi yodo mitachas chefas chaluko. Now, the reason we commented before on who all the people were in this story of Rav Yehuda and Rav Shmuel Yehuda, if the assumption is that this is his son, it's interesting that you have a father and son standing there, and the question was called out, and the son is answering in the presence of his father, and we can assume that the father was also his Torah teacher. There's a concept known as an Isser of Moira Halacha B'fnei Rabo, and we've actually discussed this in previous Shiurim in the context of Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron. Why were they killed? And they were killed by the Almighty because they were Moira Halacha B'fnei Rabo. They answered shaila in the presence of their teacher. And that's a problem. So how is it that the son is answering the question when the father is present? So we would, if you are making the assumption that in fact this is his son and viewed as his teacher, so the answer to that would be that the father gave him permission. There's a concept of giving rishus. A Rav can give rishus to his students to answer shilas. The other approach would simply be that this was not his son at all. They were two separate, unrelated individuals, just that Rav Shmuel's father happened to have the same name as Rav Yehuda was standing with him. That's, of course, a parenthetical remark. As far as the structure of the Gemara is concerned, though, we saw two Lashonos. In the first Lashon, Rav Yehuda answered the question based on statements made by Rav and Shmuel. In the second version, you have Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda answering the question by citing a Tanaic source. We continue with a question, and this question is first of all, it's a long question, but we should note on the side that at this point in the Gemara, we're going to start a topic, and the topic lasts till Daf Ayin Ches Omed Aleph, and the title is Ma'ayon Hayotzei Mibeis Kodshei HaKodoshim. There's a description, it's a prophetic passage that describes a stream issuing forth or emanating from the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKadoshim of the Beis HaMikdash, and flowing out of the Beis HaMikdash through the Heichal, through the Azorah, etc. And as it flows outwards, in this prophecy, it is expanding. You'll see how it expands to become a strong torrent of flow later. The Gemara. We're dealing with crossing of rivers, and we said in this section one is allowed to cross we saw that in Rav and Shmuel and the Tanaic source that one can cross in order to get to the other side. And in fact, we saw that one can cross even neck deep. We saw this earlier regarding the Shomrei Peros. They were allowed to cross even neck deep. So we continue in the Gemara. Maskif lo Rav Yosef u'b'choil ki hai gavna mishori. And on a weekday, is it mutter? So this question has nothing to do with Shabbos or Yom Kippur. It's a question of safety. We said before, and we're just repeating ourselves, that one can cross even neck deep through water. Rav Yosef says, is that allowed? V'hoksiv. There's a pasuk, and we indicated this is a prophetic passage from Sefer Yechezkel. The pasuk says, "Vayimad elef ba'amo vayavireini b'mayim mei of soyim." He had a vision, and he was crossed the river. He crossed water mei of soyim. Mikan shemuter lavor ad of soyim. Of soyim is a term referring to one's ankles. So from here we conclude that it's mutter to cross a river ankle deep. Vayimad elef vayavireni b'mayim mayim birkayim. We started with pasuk Gimel. This is pasuk Daled, and it says, "And I saw in my vision, I crossed water mikan shemuter lavor ad birkayim." From here we conclude you can cross even knee deep. Vayimad elef vayavireni mei mosnayim. Mikan shemuter lavor ad mosnayim. From here, it would be mutter to go waist deep. Mikan v'elech, but from this point on, deeper than this, we quote now Pasuk Hey. It says, Vayimad elef nahal asher lo uchal lavor. And we dashed on a lo uchal lavor. The point is, anything deeper than mosnayim, than waist deep, is not allowed to be crossed. So how can we have said earlier that he is allowed to cross ad savoro? By the way, we didn't mention this earlier, but if you skim up a few lines, you'll notice we have arrows to the immediate left-hand side of the Gemara text, and if you align these arrows, you can see the lower one is pointing to the right in between the lines where we indicated ad savoro, and the upper arrow is also facing that point in the Gemara text where ad savoro was cited. And we're bringing that into question right now, where we see that knee deep, waist deep, fine, more than that, not allowed. The Gemara answers, Omer Abai, Shiny Nachal de Redifi Maya. The vision of Yechezkel involved a river, a forceful flowing current of water. Redifi Maya, flowing water. That in the case of Yechezkel, it was coming forth from the Kodshe Kodshim, and the source before was talking about crossing a pool or stagnant water, a pond, maybe even a lake, but it's not flowing water. The Gemara continues. Yochol Yavirenu Besichui. Is it mutter to cross through swimming? Talmud Lomar Ki Ga'u Hamayim Mei Sachu. The pasuk is a continuation of the vision from Yechezkel, from the prophetic vision, and the pasuk says that the waters expanded to Mei Sachu, and the Gemara says, "My Mei Sachu." What does that mean? Shiyuta. Shiyuta means swimming. Sheken Korin L'Shaita Saicha. Swimming is called, here it's spelled with a samach, but in the pasuk you saw the word sachu with a sin. It's the same basic idea, sachu or saicha. So that shiyuta, which was the common Aramaic word for swimming, is in the scriptures referred to as sachu. Now, the question had been asked, can you cross the current? Are you allowed to cross the current through swimming? So the Gemara is the structure of the question was, is it allowed? And then Talmud Lomar, the response is, it's not allowed. But now, if you look at the quote of the pasuk itself, Ki go mayim meisachu, all the pasuk is describing is that the water, the stream, expanded to something you couldn't cross simply by walking through it. You would have had to swim through it, and the Gemara is taking this to mean that it is not allowed. So the Rashash explains that even though the pasuk itself says that the stream coming forth had reached the point that you would only be able to swim through it, the bottom line is at the end of the pasuk it says Asher lo ya'avor. So since it says lo ya'avor, that applies to everything from this point onwards. So that the Gemara in fact is saying, like we said, that if it would take swimming to get across, it is not allowed. Well, the Gemara goes on, Yochol Yavirenu Beburni Ketana. Is it passable? Is it crossable by going with a small sailing vessel? Burni is a ship, but it's a small ship. Talmud Lomar. So the pasuk explains, Baal Telech Bo'oni Shayit. The stream that's described in the prophetic vision will be a stream that will not be able to be crossed even with a Burni Ketana. Yochol Yavirenu Beburni Gedola. Will it be able to be crossed by a large sailing vessel? Talmud Lomar. The pasuk says, "V'tzi adir lo yavirenu." Now, what's interesting to note, by the way, is that we're dealing with the questions are dealing with the stream coming forth from the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That was described in Yechezkel, and we're using psukim from Yeshaya to answer the questions. On a very simplistic level, we just have to conclude that they are referring to the same stream in their respective prophecies. So the pasuk says that "Si adir lo yavirenu," indicating that a large sailing vessel will not be able to cross it. My mashma, how do you see that in the words? So the Gemara answers, Kidemetargem Rav Yosef, as Rav Yosef, who was an expert in Aramaic translations or Aramaic explanations, he knew the Targum. The Targum was not just a function of translation, but it was a tradition, an oral tradition that the Gemara says in Maseches Megillah that was given from Mount Sinai. And Rav Yosef, parenthetically, Rav Yosef was blind, so he had mastered, it seems, we know throughout the shots, he had mastered the Targum, the explanation of Psukim, and some might explain that there's a relationship between his blindness. Someone who was blind is not, or in general, not just someone who's blind, but in general, there is an element of restriction associated with reciting verses orally. And his association then with Torah verses couldn't be from the actual text, because that would necessitate him saying it orally, so he became expert in the Targum, which is actually a form or an extension of the oral tradition. That is parenthetical. There is literature on the topic, though. So Rav Yosef, he was a master of the Targum, and he knows the explanation of this pasuk is Lo Savil Bei Besfinas Saidin Uburni Rabosi Lo Siguzena. That's the Targum of the Tzi Adir Lo Yavirenu, referring to the stream coming forth from the Beis Hamikdash, a fisherman's boat, a Sfinas Saidin, a trapsman's boat, which is not a very large vessel, but not only that, but even a Burni Rabosi, a large vessel, Lo Siguzena, will not be able to cross it. So you can imagine that what is being described here, if to be taken on a literal level. We've mentioned on many occasions that many passages need to be analyzed on several levels. So if you are going to take it on a literal level, we're not excluding that, but if you are, then we're describing some type of amazing torrent that even large ships would not be able to cross. Omer Rav Yehuda ben Pazi af malach hamovas ein lo rishus lavor b'soichay. Rav Yehuda tells us that even the angel of death has no permission to cross this flow, and we prove it. Ksiv hocha bal telech bo oni shayit, which was a quote from Yeshaya that we saw just 4 lines above. And uksiv hosam, it says in the context of the Satan who is the Malach HaMoves, says mishot bar, it's a pasuk from Iyov, and you see the word shot. It has to do with traveling, flying, crossing, etc. So you have the word shayet and shot, hence we make the association. So that even the Malach HaMoves, who is the Satan, won't be able to cross this. We continue in the Gemara, continuing with this topic of the stream coming forth from the Chodesh HaKadoshim. We have a long point marking. In addition to that, we have a double underline series marking on the side. We have the Mivneh, the structural explanation. The double underline highlights Tiurei Hashlavim Shel Hamayon Hayotzi Bebeis Kodesh HaKadoshim. This is Tiurei, is a descriptions of the Shlavim, the stages of the stream as it emanates from the Holy of Holies. It starts off as a very narrow flow of water and expands out as it flows outwards. The Gemara. Omar Rav Pinchas Mishum Rav Huna Tzipora. Tzipora is a reference to the name of his place where Rav Huna is from. Ma'ayon Hayotzim Mibeis Kodesh HaKadoshim. The spring, the stream that flows forth from the Holy of Holies. At the outset, at its beginning, it appears as thin as the antenna of locusts. Kevon shigia lepesach heichal, as it flows through the heichal, it gets to the entrance of the heichal. It gets a little bit wider. Nase kechut shel shti. It becomes like the threads of fabric when you're placing threads on a loom. So there are 2 types of threads. There are thinner ones and thicker ones. They're known as the warp and the woof, respectively. So if that translation helps you, then the shti, the thinner of the threads, is called the warp. Kevon shigia le'ulam, as it exits the heichal and enters the ulam, the antechamber leading into the Beis Hamikdash, into the heichal, it becomes a little thicker or wider as the strings of the wolf. Kevon shigia el pesach azora, here the stream is flowing. We know that the Beis Hamikdash, one enters it from an eastern gate, walking westward toward the Holy of Holies. So here we're now following in the opposite direction. We're going eastward. So once it reaches the Pesach Azora, the entrance to the temple courtyard, Nase Kepipach Koton, it becomes as wide as the entrance, the opening of a small jar. The V'haini Disnan, based on this, we have a Tanaic source that says, Reb Lozer ben Yankov Omer, Mayim mafachin asidin lios yotzin mitachas mifton abayis. Mayim mafachim, that's water with the stream of water with the width of a small jar opening. When it gets to the mifton, the threshold of the heichal, Rashi says, Kamina pachin kishimagin lemifton heichal. That's from the entrance to the Azora to the entrance of the heichal. It has this particular width. So that's as far as Rashi is concerned. But for our purposes, we see a Tanaic source that makes reference to Mayim Apochin, a jar width of a jar entrance width of water. We continue at the second line from the top of Ayin Ches Omer Aleph. Mikan ve'elech hoyim is gaber ve'oile ad shemagia lePesach Beis David. From that point on, we've left the stream has left the Azora, and it reaches the king's palace, Pesach Beis David. So it gets stronger. Kevon shemagia lePesach Beis David. Once it reaches the king's palace, Nase kenachal shoitef. It becomes like a swift current. Shebo rochatzim zovin v'zovos nidos v'yoldos, type of stream of water in which people who need to immerse themselves to exit their state of defilement, including these kinds of tameim, zovim, zovos, nidos, and yoldos, they can immerse in this. They'd be able to immerse in this stream. Shenemar bayom yeh mokor niftach lebeis David uliyoshvei Yerushalayim lechatos ulenida. So the pasuk describes this source of water being something suitable for the impure, for the defiled to immerse in. Amar Rav Yosef mikan remez lenida shetzricha leishev ad tzavora b'mayim. From here, there is a hint to the necessity of a nida, a menstruant woman who has finished her period of tum'ah, to sit in the water neck deep. The less hilchos hakavosei, the Gemara, however, rejects that ruling, so that as far as the Gemara is concerned, it doesn't insist on the nida sitting, that the water that the nida immerses herself must be something that she can sit in neck deep. As far as how Tevila is to take place, that is a separate discussion. But as far as the Gemara here is concerned, the Gemara is rejecting Rav Yosef's ruling. As we mentioned earlier, we would discuss the issue of crossing water on Shabbos. And on the side of the Gemara, we have a nosei, and we indicate this is a hamshech, a continuation, that Ma'u lavor b'mayim b'Shabbos kishuhu lavush, aleph, now, can he cross water on Shabbos while wearing his shoes? Hayim yesh lachshish shema ipol me'al raglo v'yovu l'taltel l'dal amos. Do you have to worry that as he's crossing the river, his shoe might slip off and he'll end up carrying the shoe for a distance of 4 amos, and that's prohibited on Shabbos. So that in order to avoid the temptation of coming to carry your shoes, don't walk through the water in the first place. Now, it might be that a shoe is okay because you can tie it tightly. The Gemara will then ask about sandal mai. What about an open type shoe, a sandal, which is more loose fitting, so that even if you tell me that the shoe is not a problem, how about crossing it with a sandal? So the Gemara. Shabbos di'iko mino mai. Shabbos, when one is allowed to wear shoes as opposed to Yom Kippur, what is the din regarding crossing the water while wearing shoes, or do you have to worry about the shoe falling off and coming to tempt and be coming to carrying the shoes? Of course, when we speak about this, we're talking about someone that shoe slips off. He forgets instantly that it's Shabbos and he'll end up carrying his shoes. Omar Nechemio Chasne de Beinasia. So Nechemio, the son-in-law of the leader, says, Ano Hazise Rabbi Ami Rav Asi Demotu Urkuma Demaya. I saw Rav Ami Rav Asi reach a pool of water, the Avrua Derech Malbush, and they crossed it while clothed, including while they were wearing their shoes. They walked right through it. Teinach Minal, that's fine. I can understand that. That's good with regard to a shoe. Sandal ma'ikolamemor. What about a sandal, a looser fitting type footgear? As Rashi says, it can't be tied as tightly as a shoe. What is the din here with regard to crossing while wearing a sandal? Omar Rav Rihumi ano chazisi de Ravino the Ovar Derech Malbush. From the context, you'll have to assume that Ravino was wearing a sandal, and hence that was his answer. I saw Rav Chumi says, I saw him, even though the Gemara doesn't spell out that he was wearing a sandal. From the context, we'll have to assume that he was giving a heter for that. Rav Ashi Omar Sandal L'Chavchila Lo. Rav Ashi says that as a first choice, it would be better not to cross while wearing a sandal. So if you know ahead of time that you're going to have to walk through water, so put minol on, not sandal. Reish Gelusa Iklo Lehegronya Lebei Rav Noson. Reish Lakish went to Hagronya, it's the name of a place, to the house of Rav Noson and spent Shabbos there. Rafram V'Kulu Rabbanon Osu Lepirka, Ravina Lo Osa. Rafram and all of the other rabbis came to the drasha of the Reish Gelusa. The Reish Gelusa held forth in a Torah lecture, and Ravina did not show up. L'mochar boy Rafram Afuki LeRavina Midaite the Reish Gelusa. The next day was on Sunday, so Rafram was concerned that the Reish Gelusa would be very upset with Ravina and his absence from the Reish Gelusa's drasha yesterday on Shabbos. So Rafram wanted to quell the potential wrath or calm the Reish Gelusa from showing antipathy toward Ravina. So what did Rafram do? So Rafram initiated a sort of I don't want to say confrontation, but he tried to put Ravina on the spot so as to have the Reish Gelusa's wrath quelled. So Omar Lei, my time will also more Lapirka. So Rafram turns to Ravina on Sunday and says, well, why didn't you come yesterday to the shiur, to the lecture? Omar Lei, have a koivli karoi. My feet were pained. They hurt. So you should have put shoes on. Walk with shoes. You wouldn't feel the pain of the road as you would have come. So he says, Gaba de Kara Havoy. It was the top of my foot. The shoe would help the bottom, but the top of my foot hurt me. So he says, well, so you should have worn a type of open shoe where there would have been no pain or pressure on whatever was hurting you on the top of your foot. He says there was between where I live and where the shiur was, there was a pool of water. So Rafram says, so what? So you should have crossed it while clothed. Omalei, Ravina says, Lo Sova, Lo Mor, Lo Hodom Rav Ashi. Do you not hold from Rav Ashi's teaching, Sandal Lechatchila Lo, that wearing an open shoe, a sandal, while crossing water is not a first choice. It's not something that one ought to do. And we have a little arrow here to the right-hand side of the Gemara, aligning this with the line above where Rav Ashi appeared. So you have this story where you see an illustration of Rav Ashi's psak being taken into consideration, taken quite seriously. And at this point, we've, of course, gone over our Daf Yomi quota by almost a half an omid, but we were continuing all the time with the topic of the stream and crossing the stream or the water or the pool with shoes on Yom Kippur, and later we discussed Shabbos. Before we conclude, let us just remind you that if you wish to be in touch with us, we can be reached at gmarkings@gmail.com. With that, we conclude our Shiur for today.